Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today at our first Women in Sustainable Finance webinar for the year. My name is Amy Fong. I'm from the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. Before we get started on official proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands of which I am based today, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to extend that respect to the traditional custodians of country across Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. For those who don't know me, as I said, my name is Amy Fong. I'm from the CEFC. I'm also part of the Women in Sustainable Finance Committee. For those who haven't joined us before on one of our events, I'd like to really welcome you to our community. Women in Sustainable Finance, or WISF as we like to call it, is a networking group backed by the CEFC, and it's been around for the last 4 years supporting diversity in sustainable finance. Our goal really is to provide networking, educational and leadership opportunities to women and men progressing their careers in this sector. We have an interesting topic for today's webinar. How do we ensure an equitable transition? As we all know, the clean energy transition is well underway and accelerating at a fast pace. It's also much needed. However, it does pose some challenges for some communities and workers. And the question really is it possible to have a transition away from fossil fuels that is fair and equitable? And how actually do we achieve this? So joining me to discuss this topic, I have 3 expert speakers with me today. Kellie Court, Senior Advisor on Climate and Energy from the Australian Council of Social Service. Kellie has for the past 16 years specialised in international climate negotiations, domestic climate mitigation and resilience policy, energy policy, community advocacy and campaigning with a focus on social and environmental outcomes. I also have Cain, CEO of the Latrobe Valley Authority. Karen has been a Latrobe Valley resident for 23 years and has significant experience working across government, leading strategic innovation and developing and implementing policy in Gippsland. Her experience in developing and delivering on issues that reflect what matters to community and government has left her well prepared for her current role. Last but not least, I have Jen Stanford, Economist and Director at the Centre for Future Work. The Centre for Future Work is a progressive research institute based at the Australia Institute that conducts economic research into many labour market issues, including technology, skills, wages, inequality, new business models, and unemployment and underemployment. Jim is also the expert author of the report, Employment Aspects of the Transition from Fossil Fuels in Australia, which you can download from the resources section on the webinar. Just a quick bit of housekeeping before we get started. Today's session will run for about 40 minutes, followed by Q&A. You can ask questions at any time in the Q&A box on the screen. We'll leave questions to the end, but we'll try to answer as many as possible in the time that we have. At the end of the webinar, you'll see a questionnaire appear and we'd love to get your feedback. Thanks, everyone. Kellie, just to kick things off, I might start with you. Why does climate change and the energy transition affect groups disproportionately?
Hi, Amy, and thanks for having me today, and a big shout out to everyone that has joined. It's really pleasing that there are this many people interested in this issue around equity. And before I answer your question, I just also want to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands which I'm based today, which is the Jagera and the Turrbal people in southeast Queensland or Greater Brisbane area, and also pay my respects to elders past and present. So ACOS, so I come from ACOS, the Australian Council of Social Service, and our view is that climate change and the slow and poorly managed transition is a major threat to our vision to eliminate poverty and inequality. You know, I think over the last 2 decades, we've often heard climate change talked about as a threat to the environment, which it is, but it's also a threat to people. It threatens our homes, our livelihoods, health, quality of life, employment, and it increasingly risks the future and burdens our future generations. So we absolutely see climate change as a social justice issue. And unfortunately, from our research and experience, climate change hits people living on low incomes or experiencing disadvantage first and hardest. And that's for a number of reasons. It's because they spend disproportionately more of their incomes on basic needs and essentials, and they have fewer protections from climate change impacts and often live in the most affected areas. So, if you think of the bushfires that we experienced last summer, which devastated, large parts of New South Wales, Victoria, and other places in Queensland and Western Australia. What we see is that people on low income or experiencing disadvantage are potentially further going into poverty, or is putting more people into poverty because some people didn't have enough insurance or any insurance, so they're really struggling financially. We've seen in other areas where then finding accommodation has been challenging, rents often go up, so people are having to spend more. People have lost employment, either temporarily or long term. So it has really huge economic impacts for people, not to mention the impacts on lives and livelihoods for people that can last decades. So, and we find that people who are experiencing disadvantage are worse impacted in those cases. And similarly, with respect to the energy transition, people on low income spend on average 6.4% of their income on electricity and gas bills, compared to high income earners who are only spending 1.5%. And then they lack the ability to access the technology that could reduce their bills. And to participate in the transition. So they can't afford to, or because they rent, can't access, or they live in apartments, they're not accessing rooftop solar or energy efficiency measures. So, it can be really hard for them to be able to be part of the transition as well as afford improve their access to energy, I guess is what I'm saying. And we often find people end up either depriving themselves of energy or find themselves in debt. So it's often one or the other, and which often means that they're missing out on other essentials like medical, health, kids not going to school activities, not having food, et cetera, et cetera. So, we're deeply concerned that climate change and that poorly managed transition can actually, as I said before, deepen poverty and drive people more into poverty.
That's interesting. How do you think, Australia as a whole is tracking, in making sure that the transition's equitable? Is it, what factors make up an equitable transition, and, how are we measuring on those?
Yeah. So, what we need to be aiming for is that people are not left behind and ideally are benefiting from the transition. The cost of the transition is distributed equitably, and those who can at least afford to pay the transition pay the least and are actively supporting. And we've often heard in America this whole Green Deal sort of thing and it certainly is true, we're different to America. We have some additional supports, but equally, I don't think we're tracking that well in terms of the equitable transition. And there is a real opportunity, if we do the transition well, that we can reduce inequality and poverty at the same time. So, what we have seen is that often policies and subsidies for access to renewable energy, for example, have been poorly targeted. So we support subsidies. We support the need to incentivise the shift to the transition. But to date, Australia has been very bad at doing it in a targeted, equitable way. So often things are being done through electricity bills, like, the small-scale the SRES, for example, and the LRET. Feed-in tariffs have all come off electricity bills, so people who can least afford it are paying for it, and they're not getting the full benefit because they don't access like rooftop solar, for example. And when we do see governments provide subsidies for rooftop solar and batteries and those sorts of things, they're aiming at people that are middle and high income and, you know, not really investing in low income households. You know, mind you, Victorian government recently announced a big investment in social housing to access energy efficiency and potentially solar. And they're the sorts of policies that we need to see everywhere to ensure that people aren't going to be left behind.
Yeah, it's not just those from lower socioeconomic areas that are potentially impacted as well. Jim, your report, the employment aspects away of the transition from fossil fuels, looked at Australia's labour market as a whole and the proportion of fossil fuel jobs in relation to that. Can you tell us a little bit about what the transition will actually mean for jobs in Australia and workers?
Thank you, Amy, and thank you for the invitation to participate today. And I will reference that report, Employment Aspects of the Transition from Fossil Fuels, which is available on our website at the Center for Future Work. So you can Google that if you'd like to see the full report. Well, the first task in figuring out what the transition will look like in the labor market is to figure out how important fossil fuel jobs are in the labor market. And that turned out to be kind of an interesting exercise, frankly, and the importance of direct employment in fossil fuel industries is smaller than is often argued or suggested in popular discourse. In 2019, the most recent data we have, about 1% of all employed Australians worked in some role in a fossil fuel industry, including coal mining, oil and gas, petroleum products and refining, and fossil fuel dependent electricity generation. So, you know, 1%, that's an important number of jobs, about 130,000 jobs in total. You wouldn't want to snap your fingers and see those disappear overnight, but nobody is suggesting that. So the overall quantum of fossil fuel employment is relatively modest. Moreover, the relative share of fossil fuel jobs has been shrinking already for several years. So in our estimate, if the transition is a gradual one, announced well in advance, and supported with important measures such as early retirement incentives, redeployment and reskilling opportunities, income insurance provisions, and others, it absolutely can be achieved without a dramatic disruption in the overall labor market.
But Jim, what about there's other jobs that aren't directly in the fossil fuel industry but are indirectly dependent on those industries, particularly in regional areas? You have retail and other services like that support workers in coal mining towns. What's going to happen to them, and how can we support those regions?
I think there's a fair question about the relationship between direct jobs in any industry and then the indirect jobs that in one way or another are related to that industry. And that includes what I call upstream jobs, jobs in the various supply and service industries which feed into any sector, and the downstream jobs, which are the consumer spending, services industries, retail, as you mentioned, Amy, and other jobs which depend on the consumer spending power of workers in those industries. But you have to be very careful in thinking, well, does that mean that if you work in a store in a coal mining town that you depend directly on fossil fuels? That's not entirely clear. What you do depend on is there being some industry that provides an initial impetus to investment and employment in that region. And then whatever industry that is, its workers are going to go out and spend their money. So the retail job will be there as long as there's enough attention given to supporting the regional economic base, if you like. And that's why over time, especially in regions which have a high preponderance of fossil fuel work, over time, we're going to have to find other industries that invest and create jobs in those regions. And then both the upstream and the downstream jobs will have other sources of demand to keep them in business. So I know there are advocates of the fossil fuel industry, who try to add up every possible connection to a coal mine or some other fossil fuel project and say these are fossil fuel jobs too. And economically, that's not believable. That's just not the case. What we do have to make sure is that the transition away from fossil fuels occurs in the context of a strong strategy to promote investment and job creation across the whole gamut of other industries. And that will be an important part of making sure that we do this effectively and without great harm to even those regional communities.
So where do you see the actual opportunities are across the economy in the energy transition? One obviously is being the renewable energy sector.
Yeah, well, there's a temptation, Amy, to say the transition is being driven by a shift in the energy industry. So, people who lose work or where jobs disappear in, say, coal mining, will look for work in the new renewable energy industries that are springing up. And that's fair enough, but we're missing most of the picture if we limit our discussion about transition to that, because the fossil fuel sector makes up 1% of the labor market, as we just talked about. Renewable energy industries will only make up about 1% as well. There's some studies that say there might be additional work in renewable energies compared to the number of jobs that disappear over time in fossil fuel industries, because fossil fuel industries are very, very capital intensive. They actually produce very few jobs. Considering how much money goes through them, but you're still looking at just 2% of the national economy. I'm frankly more concerned with the other 98% of the national economy. There's a whole gamut of other industries in the goods sector, in the services sector, in the public sector, in the private sector, where job opportunities will open up over the coming decades as we transfer away from fossil fuels. And remember, this transition isn't going to happen overnight. Optimistically, I think we could phase out most uses of fossil fuels over the next 20 years. And we have to in order to meet our climate objectives and try to limit the impacts of climate change. But 20 years is a long time for a labor market to adjust. And the Australian economy produces hundreds of thousands of new jobs across that whole gamut of industries every year. So there's lots of opportunities, including in regional communities, to think about where the new jobs or the replacement jobs are going to come from. Healthcare is a good one. Healthcare is the biggest employer in Australia's economy. Healthcare employs 13% of Australian workers versus 1% in fossil fuels. And in fact, healthcare produces as many new jobs every 2 years as exist in fossil fuels in total. So just 2 years of new job creation in healthcare would be enough to absorb every single fossil fuel worker if they were displaced in 2 years. But that's not going to happen. Because it's going to be a much more gradual process. But there's lots of other industries: construction, manufacturing, non-fossil fuel resources, transportation, technology, services. So really, the possibilities are infinite, and it will depend on the specific interests of individuals who end up looking for alternative employment and the opportunities that are present in each regional community.
Well, if we can just talk about those regional communities, I can turn to Karen, who is seeing firsthand the impacts of the transition in her community in the Latrobe Valley. Karen, can you tell us a bit about the history of the Latrobe Valley area and how and why the Latrobe Valley Authority came about?
Thank you, Amy, and good morning, everybody, and it's great to join everybody this morning. So the Latrobe Valley, for people in this session today, is about 2 hours southeast of Melbourne. It's been a coal mining community for over 100 years now. We have 3 large coal-fired power stations, and Hazelwood Power Station closed in 2017, the first of those mines to close. So this has been an economy in the valley based on coal mining for quite some time. But as Jim said, there are many other industries in this community as well. So the authority is a state government authority set up in 2016. Not a long lead time to the closure of Hazelwood, 4 months in fact. So not the good practice we want to see about long lead time. But again, it happened, and again, a globally owned mine made a decision to close. So the authority was set up to work here in community, with community, and to look at what needed to be done to respond to that closure, to look at recovery and to longer term transition for the community. So we're a team of 37 people. Majority of our team members are local people. So this is our community, and the model in which the authority was set up is a really important aspect of understanding how a government agency can work differently. So we were given the opportunity to be as creative as we needed to be with resources and the authorisation to do things as required. So the important part about the authority and its approach has been to really understand the context, early response, up to 1,000 workers losing their jobs within four months, and that's direct workers, both employees of the company but contractors as well. And as Jim pointed out, and as you did too, Amy, the upside and the downside of that in terms of connected businesses, directly connected businesses. So 150 supply chain businesses impacted as well, and workers associated with that. And as Kellie said, potential implications for impact on many people in this community. And one of the things I think we should be recognising here is the history of places and the pride in which communities have seen themselves in contributing to the economy, not only here in Victoria in terms of energy production, but energy production into other states. So one of the things is to be conscious of how people view themselves, and the big shift from that industry closing down emotionally has had a big impact on this community. So it's not about denying that past, it's about celebrating that past, but then looking to the future. So that set the scene for a whole lot of work that needed to be done. And the state government not only established the authority, but committed $266 million into a stimulus package for 4 years, significant dollars. And one of the things I think that was really well planned out and done well was a whole lot of activity to pick up all of the points that both Jim and Kellie have talked about. So I'll give you some very practical examples. So Kellie, one of the programs was to upgrade 1,000 homes in this community with energy efficient capacity. And that was free of charge, and that was for low-income families and renters. So we've got 1,000 homes now that have had access to somebody coming in, whether it's solar panels or solar heating, and upgraded those homes regardless of where those homes were. That's reduced costs for those families, and the feedback we've had from that, it's been very, very well taken up. So that's one example. Just in terms of jobs, though, it is about creating jobs, and as Jim said, and I can go into this a little bit later, about where those jobs come from, how you generate jobs, and the point being made about where do 1,000 plus people transition into. And Jim's point about assumptions about workers wanting to stay in the industry that they're in is an assumption. So we've supported over 1,500 people personally now in partnership with other agencies here on finding what they wanted to do for their future. A third of that worker population retired, but they just didn't retire to do retirement. Some of those workers wanted to set up their own business or wanted to undertake some investment. Majority of the people stayed living here, so there's an assumption also that people leave. That's not the case. They want to stay in their own community. And the other opportunities around where the jobs were being created. So I'm happy to talk a bit more about that as we get into that. But we've now created over 3,800 jobs in the last 4 years. And the unemployment rate here dropped to the second lowest in Victoria, in rural Victoria, through a whole lot of incentives and stimulus. And I'm quite happy to talk about inclusion as well, and Kellie's point about making sure everyone benefits from that stimulus and the growing economy here. And yes, here, the health sector is the largest employer here. So we've done a lot of work with the health sector in understanding where the jobs are and entry into the workforce for people who may not normally have the ability to enter the workforce. So we've looked at supporting industry and business, skills and training, community groups, and brought in research and really brought in some both national and international thinking about contemporary regional development. So I'm quite happy to talk about that a bit later if that's helpful.
Yeah, I think that is, Karen, you mentioned you looked at overseas examples of countries that have done the transition well, and Jim, I know you speak to that in your report. Could you tell us a little bit about what countries have done handled the transition well, and what we can learn from them? Jim or Karen, if you'd like to start.
Well, sure. I can jump in.
Jim,
Amy.
Go first, and I'll talk about our experience as well. Yep.
And I think the experience in the Latrobe Valley actually stands out in international comparison, despite the problem of the short notice, which Karen emphasized, which is terrible. There's no need for it to be a short notice. These should be things that we plan 5, 10, 15, and 20 years in advance. So to come in and pull the plug on a major facility within a few months just because it benefits the shareholders of that company rather than providing the sort of notice that we need, that's the sort of thing that we have to eliminate. And despite that, Karen's team and their partners have done a tremendous job. Other examples, I'd say the gold standard is how Germany phased out its black coal mining industry. Over a 20-year period, exactly as we're talking about. The timetable was announced well in advance. A whole suite of measures were provided to support workers, both to move into retirement, to pursue alternative vocations, whether that's a new occupation or starting a small business, to facilitate job creation and diversification in industry, in communities which depended on that mining. And the whole process was completed. And at the end, there wasn't a single involuntary redundancy. An industry that employed 80,000 people disappeared over a 20-year period without anyone being thrown into unemployment. And of course, Germany's been moving forward very aggressively with renewable energy developments that have helped it economically. Other countries have done very similar things. Spain and Netherlands have very successful programs of supported transitions without involuntary redundancies. In my home country of Canada, the province of Ontario completely eliminated coal-fired electricity generation over about a 12-year period through a phased timeline. Similar supports, not one job loss in terms of involuntary unemployment. So there's lots of examples to show how it can be done. The crucial bit is to make the commitment to do it, set a timetable, stick to that timetable, and then provide both the workers and communities with the supports that they need to adjust.
So just adding on to Jim's description of where it's been done well, we've paid attention to that. So I think learning from other places is very, very important. And one of the things that I think is critical here is to look at where tested practice has occurred. So we've built on what Jim has just described in terms of how we do our work and planning for the future around that, because that's only one coal mine here that's closed. We're anticipating more. So, and that will be sooner rather than later. So this is a long-term future transition work here. And we don't talk just about transition, we talk about transformation as well. So what are the conditions that we need to establish as a community for that long-term sustainable prosperity? And so it's understanding the conditions that are required to take a look at the assets, so the gaps and the opportunities here, and where are the assets here that we can build on. So one of the things we did do was investigate the work in the Hunter Valley early on to understand their approach post-closure of the steel industry there. And we've also gone to the City of Geelong to have a look at the work that they've done post-closure of the automotive industry. So we've drawn on some local examples here in Australia, and what that led us to is to really investigate what contemporary regional development is. And when we talk about regional development in Australia, we're talking rural regional, but from a European experience, regional means any location, whether it's a city or sub-region or an individual location. So that took us to the OECD and the EU Commission to have a look at the work around what we mean by contemporary regional development. And so this is not just about economics, this is social, this is environmental, and it's the intersection of those three important aspects of society that we need to factor in. So we've worked very closely with the EU Commission directly through the EU Centre of Excellence at RMIT here in Melbourne and through Melbourne University. And we've been working with some international economic geographers to understand what are the conditions required for a place to build a sustainable, prosperous future. And so 20 years of research with the EU looking at place-based work, bottom-up and top-down intersection of policy, but also how you create those conditions locally. And we've had 3 years of work now looking at that transformational piece, and that's really paying dividends. So we've got over 2,000 people now involved in innovation inquiry and looking at the strengths of this community. And energy, in terms of skills and knowledge, is a strength still here. So we still need to recognise that and celebrate that. But as Jim said, we're investigating what are the competitive advantages here, what are the specialisations that this region can investigate and look at innovation and leadership and the conditions that are required. So we now understand those conditions. And one of the conditions is around collaboration and innovation and leadership and bringing people together. So our role as a government agency is not about taking a lead. It is about facilitation and collaboration and building partnerships. So all of our work now focuses on that. And we've got some great work going on here now. And people have shifted. We've measured sentiment over time, and that's really important about the way people view things. And the other really important part of this is having a team of people who are skilled and capable in, asking the first questions: what matters to people? What really matters? Are we really listening? And we are really bringing people together who have similar things that they care about. And it's not about consultation. This is about serious collaboration and partnership, working on things that matter to people. But it's not just about opinion, and it's not about just the usual suspects, and it's not just about what people want. It's about a really strong evidence base about what's needed and testing that. Local expertise, external expertise, and bringing a whole combination of knowledge together to work on things that are real and are evidence-based that are going to succeed. So we're working in the food and fibre sector now on some fantastic inquiries around innovation there. We're working in the health sector on that. We're working in the tourism sector on that and in the energy sector. And if we have time, I've got a great story to tell about the health sector, building on what Jim was saying about opportunities. So that's the transformational work we're doing now. And it's really important to move to that quickly, because we can wallow in despair, and we've got to pay attention to that, but people have to see a future. And the sentiment has shifted here. Nobody is saying the future here is about coal anymore.
That's really assuring to hear that. Just wanted to get Kellie's view in terms of examples, both locally or internationally, that of case studies where the transition has been handled well for the broader sort of vulnerable communities that you spoke of at the beginning. Can you give us any examples like that have worked well?
Thanks, Amy. Actually, I am going to struggle to give you some examples of where it's been done well, because I think typically it hasn't been done well, not for people. I think the examples that Jim and Karen have given around communities, so Germany, Spain is another country that have just embarked on a really ambitious policy around helping their coal communities and employees transition, what's happening even here in Australia. But I think it can be challenging to find those good examples of actually supporting vulnerable people in part of this transition. So yes, unfortunately, I don't know if Jim's got any examples.
Well, the way to support vulnerable people is to support vulnerable people all the time. That's the challenge. So we can look at other countries that do support vulnerable people and promote social inclusion as a core part of their ongoing economic and social policies. And by the way, the energy transition is one aspect of that. So I think in terms of the general inequality and marginalization of certain groups of society, which we're so concerned with in Australia, we should be solving that problem directly. We're having a big debate right now over income supports and the what's going to replace the job seeker and coronavirus supplements, and people are desperate to have some income support. And the energy transition challenges that Kellie spoke of earlier are part of the challenging world that they face. So if we want to support vulnerable communities, we have to support them all the time.
I might just add
absolutely,
to that
Jim.
discussion.
I was thinking specifically around the energy transition. So yes, there are some good examples in much better ongoing support for people in terms of basic incomes and those sorts of things. And yes, job seeker, and I was going to mention this later, that we're supporting people for their basic needs. And ACOS has a strenuous campaign at the moment around the need to increase job seeker. What the government announced recently is completely inadequate. And, until we address that basic cost of living, it's going to be challenging both in terms of the energy transition and climate impacts to be able to help people, cope, adapt and recover from these impacts unless they have their basic needs met.
Karen, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I think both Jim and Kellie are absolutely right. It is about what the continuous work is around this. But I think there are opportunities in transition, given the focus, to make the most of those opportunities. So where the gaps are, so where are things not working, and what do we do about that? So one of the gaps we found, despite having welfare agencies here who do a great job in providing support for families and people in our community, one of the gaps we found was the gap between welfare support and employment, and particularly for 16 to 25-year-olds. So one of the things we did was say, what do we do about that? So again, the way the authority has been set up, we have funds, we can be flexible, we can undertake immediate action to look at working to find solutions in a collaborative way, as I've said, around partnership. So we worked with those agencies, but we also worked with young people here, and we worked with an organisation called Ladder, which is an AFL affiliated agency that works nationally on working with young people. We also worked with the Young Australians organisation around some of the work that they were doing. So we sought out to find out what else was happening, and we supported a very different way for young people then to be engaged in getting into either into employment or back into education and training. So there's 130 young people between 16 and 25, with 90% of those young people after 2 years either got a job or back into education. And the model around that was what mattered to those young people, and them with support directing their own future. That's been fabulous, and the growth in those young people. So at the end of the day, employment's important. Employment's important. So how do we understand the starting points for people in our community and being aware and conscious of those starting points, and what are the supports and structures you put in place to close that gap of non-employment to employment? So we work a lot with our local neighbourhood houses where people go because they trust those environments. So it's working where people are at and listening and developing things according to need, not assumptions. So these are not preordained programs, they're customised. And that's one of the things I think we don't do well. We set policies, we develop programs, and we deliver them, normally as government agencies, but we actually don't design what is needed on the ground and bespoke approaches here based on what matters to the people who you want to have engaged in those opportunities. So I think that's one of the big policy challenges for government agencies and any agencies that work with families and people who are looking for changes in their life. So we've got some really good examples of what's worked here, and we think we could learn a lot from some of the partners that we work with. So I might just leave that there.
Yeah, I know the panel has all mentioned sort of government policy as being the key to the transition. However, I'm really interested to know what the private sector can do, particularly investors. What role do they have to play in managing and helping an equitable transition? And that's a question probably for all of the panel. So, Jim, do you want to start?
Okay, Amy, thank you. It's going to be very important to enlist all the stakeholders, government, business, workers and their trade unions, community development, community government, post-secondary education institutions. They've all got a real important role to play in a comprehensive and well-planned transition. Private sector is going to be critical here. First of all, I think the financial community, who are obviously well represented in our session today, very important role to demand transparency and accountability from the firms that you invest in regarding the economic and social environmental risks that are associated with different lines of business, and to start demanding that companies in the fossil fuel sector start planning now. Instead of trying to pretend that this isn't happening. And we've seen around the world how important those demands from investors and the investment community can be in shaking up leadership in fossil fuel companies and pushing them to say, yes, you're right, this is a line of business that's going to disappear. What are we going to do to protect the firm and all of its stakeholders, including investors, as that happens? Obviously, lots of opportunities for private investors and private business in the other side of the coin, which is the big growth in renewable energy and all of the opportunities, including direct participation in renewable energy projects, but also those upstream and downstream opportunities, spin-off jobs that we were talking about earlier. Huge opportunities in Australia, for example, to develop a supply chain that feeds into the renewable energy sector, given our resources of lithium, for example. Australia is the largest exporter of lithium in the world. There's going to be a huge demand for that. And right now we're doing almost nothing with it other than digging it up and shipping it out of the country. So huge business opportunities there to take our resources, capitalize on the endowment of renewable energy that we have in Australia and make good money out of it.
So Kellie, did you want to add to that as well?
Yeah, I think there's probably 4 key areas that in the investor community can really engage in this. One is the corporate engagement, then investment strategy and asset allocation. The 4th is policy, advocacy and partnership, and then and then the next one is around disclosure. So if you go back to corporate engagement, it sort of taps into what Jim was just saying. It's really about investors can require the companies that they're major investors in to consider the impacts on communities, workers and people as part of their transition. So coal companies that should be, as Jim has said earlier, they should be planning this, 5-10 years in advance and not just giving short notice. And investors can absolutely be signaling that to companies that they invest in. In terms of investment strategy and asset allocation, we'd like to see partnerships to support financing to make access to energy like solar energy efficiency batteries accessible, more access for people on low income, partnering with community housing providers, partnering with Indigenous communities. I mean, there's a lot you can be doing through partnerships to actually help people be part of the transition and benefit from the transition. And then around policy advocacy and partnership, look, that's just absolutely critical. ACOS is in partnership with the Australian Climate Roundtable that has business groups, and the investor group on climate change is a core part of that. We have a set of principles that equity is absolutely a core part of that. But and we do joint work often on these issues, but going beyond that, we'd like to see this sector support some of the basic policies that we're advocating for, like increase in job seeker, for example, and investment in energy efficiency for low-income households. Having their voice out there publicly and privately to government is really important. These really important equity policies increased in terms of visibility and the priority on government agenda.
That's very interesting. Karen, in terms of the Latrobe Valley Authority partnering with private investors or private companies, can you give us some examples of where that has worked well and what we can learn from those? Or would you like to see more of that happening?
Well, it's certainly we always like to see more, but one of the things, as I said right from the beginning, one of the questions we asked was what matters to people. And when we say people, whether it was industry and business, whether it was our training organisations, community groups, local government, state government here in this community. And one of the things we did find from business, and as Jim said, construction as part of the stimulus package here and more broadly in Victoria, a big construction boom going on. So construction has just not stopped, even despite COVID here. So it's been one of the growth sectors here and opportunities for jobs. But one of the things when we spoke to builders and building industry here, one of the biggest challenges that they faced was procuring tenders and keeping jobs local and ethical jobs. And so that's really important. So we said, well, if that is an issue, we need to do something about that. So again, as I mentioned, we had done some work with Geelong, and they had engaged with a procurement specialist, a company that specialises in growing local procurement. They're a company that works nationally and has done some international work. We engage with them and have for the last 3 years now with businesses here. How do you grow businesses for local jobs? How do we ensure that contracts have a high percentage of local businesses undertaking the work, local supplies and then local workers? Because if you are actually going to build the conditions and the capability of the economy here, we have to upskill not only the workers but business capability to understand the opportunities beyond, what has been a fairly stable economy here. So if businesses have been operating in a stable economy, they haven't had to change their practice much. So when a shift like this happens, there's a really important piece of work to assist those businesses to adapt and adjust. So we have grown this significantly. We set up an online space for businesses to connect, and there's well over 1,000 businesses now called Gippsland Connect who are working together. We helped businesses form consortia so that they were more successful in getting large tenders. But from an investor perspective, investors coming here, it is about how are you going to ensure that any investment and contracts then are going to benefit local businesses and local workers and local suppliers. And so we've managed to do that. We've really grown that. And so I think from this community, investors coming here are going to get much more support. And I think the issue of social responsibility here to undertake, building into their contracts a requirement that they work with communities to provide that opportunity for local businesses and workers first. The other arm of that was then working with businesses here around social inclusion for employment. So we now have a partnership with a number of businesses to have a look at their practices, employment practices. So if they've never thought about what it means for having a strong inclusion employment policy and practice, we're now working with businesses to understand that. And so we've got a number of employees now going into businesses who would normally have not got jobs. So all of that is really important. If you think of the renewable energy side of this in terms of investment, and there has been some bad press about some of the practices about some renewable energy projects in the country, we're working very closely with our unions here, and I haven't even talked about that partnership, and that's been critical to the transition here. So we have a very strong partnership with our Trades and Labour Council here, who have been in partnership with us, providing their members with additional training for other jobs. And over 900 tickets now for their members to go into the construction industry, for instance. So that partnership around ethical jobs, but jobs that are of worth and jobs that are equitable in terms of wages and conditions is as important. So I think from an investor's point of view, it's not just about making money. It is about the social license here and supporting rural communities to grow, and there's mutual benefit, both for the investor and the community. And I think investors will get a lot of support for their brand or for their company if we can create those conditions.
Thank you, Karen. What I'm hearing from across the panel is there's plenty of opportunities for the private sector to play a part in this transition and making sure that it's just and equitable. I might just turn to audience Q&A because there's quite a few questions coming in. The first one, maybe for Jim, is Jim, very interested in your discussion about long-dated transitions for individual power stations leading to nil jobs being lost overseas. A couple of questions here. Were the owners of those power stations private or public? And did the initiative to have the extended lead time to closure come from government regulations or from private owners? Sort of what differs between those jurisdictions and Australia?
That's important to bring out some of those details behind them all. The Canadian example that I gave you of the plants in Ontario, which is Canada's most populous province, had the advantage in doing a plan like this is that they were owned by a publicly owned electricity network. So there was no question about the company's ability to plan a system-wide evolution like that, and it certainly helped. In Germany's case, when they closed the coal mining sector, that was an example in the mining sector, although they're doing it now in the coal power sector. The government also recognized that public ownership would be important for the planning, so they actually nationalized the coal industry as a prelude to planning for its eventual shutdown, which you could say seems counterintuitive, but it actually assisted in facilitating it. In Australia's case, given the privatization and fragmentation of the electricity system in most states, that is an added complication, and it will require government regulation 100% to help to set the timetables for this phase out. And to require the private companies involved to think about the social interest in a phased, transparent, planned transition, rather than just pulling the plug on their own facilities whenever they think it makes most sense from their own profit loss perspective. So the fragmentation of private ownership in energy in Australia's case is going to be an added complication, but it can be overcome.
Yep. Just another question for you, Jim, on the fossil fuel related jobs. Do you have any indication of what proportion of people currently employed in fossil fuel industries would require the support to retrain versus those who will be looking to take early retirement? So what's the age profile and what impact does that have on the transition plans needed?
Yeah, that's another really important question and a huge opportunity, frankly, particularly when you're thinking about a 20-year timetable for this phase out. Most existing fossil fuel workers in Australia will retire within those 20 years. So as long as we phase out the transition and the downsizing of fossil fuel employment, most of the work, if you like, can be done by just moving people into retirement. And that's helped by the fact that, on average, fossil fuel workers are older, significantly older than the average for the Australian labour force as a whole. So certainly, over half of the required reduction in time would be taken up through retirements and early retirement. So most of the people in the industry would not ever have to learn another job or move to another location or pick up another occupation. They can simply retire. The key task here is to make sure that their positions aren't backfilled with new people coming into an industry that is soon going to disappear. If we allow that to happen, again, because of a failure to set a timetable and stick to it, then we'll make the problem much worse than it needs to be.
Thanks, Jim. A question coming in from Karen. The experience in Latrobe Valley setting up new industries, do you have any examples of how the Latrobe Valley Authority have facilitated those new industries and with new jobs? I think you mentioned earlier there were 3,800 jobs created. What kind of jobs were they in? What industries, what sectors, so forth?
A number of sectors. So as I said at the start, the $266 million investment here from the state government was across all departments. So there were state government department jobs, health jobs associated with expansion of the local hospital, energy jobs associated with renewables. As I mentioned to you, the upgrading of 1,000 homes, that was local employees. Going into industry to expand businesses. So there was some incentives for businesses to expand with some government grants. We have funds to relieve government costs for businesses who are paying for stamp duty or planning permits on agreement that they will employ people. So there are many, many different layers of incentives for businesses to grow here and attract businesses here across all sectors. So it's not any one particular sector, but we're really starting to hone in now on new job creation in industries that, as I mentioned before, are the future for this community. So I don't have the breakdown of those jobs here with me, but that's generally the story that goes with those jobs. So it's across all sectors, some about expanding businesses that currently exist, supporting new businesses to start up. So we also have worked with local government here about supporting startup businesses and incentives for those businesses to grow and support. So it's not necessarily... We have had business support and expansion where 100 jobs have been created, but we also understand that the majority of businesses that we have here are small to medium. So it's not necessarily just bringing in big employers here. It is how do you grow the business that you already have, because that is where the community is. So as I mentioned, construction has been big. That's employed people. we've put in some very significant infrastructure here around livability, and I haven't even mentioned that. So upgrading really quite significant sporting facilities here, but also local facilities. So we've had a community facility fund, which is about upgrading local halls and local sporting clubs. But what does that do? That employs your local plumber, it employs your local builder. So those jobs are created in a whole range of ways because it's a very complex environment when you talk about community. So you package all of those together and make sure that everyone at some stage or other is benefiting on support for growth and support for employment.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Karen. I actually think that's a great note to leave on. We've reached time on this webinar, fortunately, but I really appreciate all the speakers' viewpoints on this. It's not all doom and gloom, it seems. There's plenty that can be done to ensure an equitable transition as long as there's long-term planning and collaboration in communities and across the economy. So I'd like to thank a huge thank you to our speakers again, Jim, Karen and Kellie, for sharing your thoughts with us. Thanks again to the CEFC for hosting this webinar. These events wouldn't be possible without the support of our hosts. So if you are interested in hosting an event, please feel free to contact Women in Sustainable Finance. It's wisf@cefc.com.au. And you can just drop us an email and we'll reach out to you. You also see a short survey pop up at the end of this webinar, and we hope to get your feedback. Thanks, everyone. I hope to see you at the next event.